Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's lecture on Chicanas and the movement. The reading covers these organizations and parts of the Chicano movement of the 60s and 70s in more detail. So I'm only going to mention them here, but the reading gives you more information about these, as well as the specific role that women had in all of these activist groups. So the components of the Chicano movement included the farm worker movement, which was primarily carried out by the United Farm Workers, led by Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta. In New Mexico, there was a land grant movement that was led by Reyes Lopez Tijerina. Of course, in Denver, we had the Crusade for Justice, led by Corky Gonzalez. La Raza Unida Party, which was meant to be sort of a third political party, began in Texas and spread through different parts of the Southwest. The student blowouts, which were protests by high school students, began in high schools in Los Angeles, where students walked out of their schools in protest of how some of their teachers were treating them, the fact that they didn't have enough representation among their teachers, that there wasn't representation in their curriculum. And this kind of movement also spread to other high schools, including here in Denver. In colleges, we had the student movement through the creation of organizations like Mecha and other student organizations in colleges primarily throughout the Southwest, who also made demands for representation in the faculty, increased number of Chicano students at the universities, as well as the creation of programs like Chicano Studies. There is also another component, which was anti-war movement against the excessive participation of Mexican Americans in the draft to go fight in the Vietnam War. One of the major protests against this was the Chicano moratorium. And so again, all of these are discussed in the chapter for this week from the Vicky Ruiz book, but she focuses on the role of women in these organizations, which are often ignored by Chicano movement historians. So I'm going to focus more on the feminism aspects of this time period and within the movement. So part of what Chicana feminism started to do during this time period, as we talked before, was to respond to popular images of women within the community, like La Malinche and La Virgen de Guadalupe. But they also challenged the machismo that existed within many of these organizations. Women were often considered sellouts if they espoused any feminist ideology within some of the movement organizations, particularly in student movements on college campuses. Women were relegated to supportive roles as the typists, the cooks, the fundraisers, but rarely were allowed to take on leadership positions. The reading also talked about the Chicana Denver Youth Conference and the tensions that arose there among women, where women talked about various issues that affect Chicana women in particular. But when it came to kind of report out to the bigger conference, they declared that the Chicana woman did not want to be liberated. And as the reading discussed, many women felt that that was kind of the public idea they had to take because of the resistance by the men. In 1971, the first National Chicana Conference was held in Houston, Texas, to create a feminist platform for the Chicano movement. Among the issues they addressed included abortion rights, daycare needs, access to higher education, egalitarianism in their marriages, but we also see some of those tensions between women who felt that they should just focus on Chicano movement issues and women who felt that they needed to incorporate issues of feminism within the bigger Chicano movement. So the Houston Conference was organized by local women who were affiliated with the YWCA in Houston, Texas. This location and sponsorship of the conference became one of the sticking points of those women who chose to walk out from the conference, arguing that the dependence on a mainstream white women's organization was a big issue. Due to the much larger number of participants than they had expected, this also affected some of the logistical experiences in the conference, like having enough housing, food, and so on. So those that walked out critiqued the conference as selfish, to be talking about gender issues when there were other issues like Chicanos in Vietnam and the farm worker movement. So the divisions that were created around this conference were around cultural authenticity, loyalists to the Chicano nationalist movement versus Chicana feminists, the argument about Anglo-influenced organizing in conference because they participated with the YWCA versus a homegrown approach. And there were also regional differences that were perceived between the Chicanas that were coming from California versus the Chicanas in Texas. Some of the issues discussed at the conference included, at the Houston conference, were around sexuality in the Chicana, specifically reproductive rights, the sexual double standard, and the importance of having positive sexuality. They also discussed the role of the Catholic Church. There were actually Chicana nuns that participated in the conference, where there were women who were influenced by the liberation theology movement that was going on throughout Latin America at that time, where there were members of the Catholic Church, priests, bishops, nuns, that were taking a much more liberal approach to Catholicism versus those that felt that the Catholic Church was an oppressor to women and should not be supported. So there were a number of issues that were discussed for the first time, really, by Chicana women coming together at this conference, but they weren't necessarily all in agreement about all of these issues. The reading also talked about what the acceptable image of Chicana women involved in the Chicano movement, particularly from the perspective of men, was the image of the soldadera or la Adelita. As I mentioned before, when we talked about la soldadera, she returns during this time period as another iconic image. For women, they represented a middle ground between loyalists and feminists because they were accepted by men as women who fought beside their men and cared for them. They weren't perceived as a threat or like they were being challenged. But this particular image here demonstrates sort of like the idealistic image of la soldadera or la delita from a masculinist perspective. The reading also highlighted some women who were leaders during this time period and the unique kinds of things they were doing during this time period. One of these women was Alicia Escalante, who was born in Texas in 1933. She grew up living in poverty with her mother in California. And when she herself became an adult, she ended up also living in poverty and having to need the assistance of welfare. She formed the East Los Angeles Chicana Welfare Rights Organization in 1967, specifically to bring attention to these women and the rights that they had to the kind of assistance that welfare offices were offering. So she also participated in organizing single mothers with their children to attend the Poor People's Campaign in 1968 in Washington, D.C. Here we also see her participating on a float in the Denver Crusade for Justice parade. So she was one of those women who not only created her own organization to address a particular issue that Chicanas who were living in poverty were experiencing, but she also participated and supported some of the other initiatives in other areas of the movement as well. And one of the reasons why I in particular like to highlight her is because she was organizing women on welfare, a group of women that are often persecuted in the media, that are often not talked about, are only perceived as women who are dependent on the government, who are burdens to society, who all they do is have children so that they can collect a bigger check. Demonstrating that these women have participated and have been actively engaged historically in activism during the Chicano movement really sort of helps to break sort of, excuse me, some of the stereotypical images of women on welfare. One of the other organizations that was created at this time that was unique was the Chicana Action Service Center, which was founded by Comisión Femenil member Francisca Flores, and it was an anti-poverty agency exclusively serving women of the barrio, particularly a large number of the women that they served were single women. The center helped in offering job training and placement and existed for a number of decades past the Chicano movement era. One of the other things that the reading discusses, however, is the resistance that many of these women experienced from male leadership. Personal decisions like intermarriage became politically debated and caused divisions, where some argued against intermarriage, arguing that intermarriage was a threat to the loyalty to the Chicano movement. And this was particularly expressed towards Chicana women who decided to date white men or to date non-Chicano men, whereas many of the Chicano men themselves were dating and marrying white women. Educated Chicanas were perceived as too assimilated by Chicano men, and that was sort of the excuse that was given for why they were choosing to marry white women. Another area for development and division was around sexual orientation, where Chicana lesbians were able to come out and participate more in voicing their experiences, particularly in Chicana-led organizations, but they were often as well excluded from some of the other Chicano community organizations or to be part of, participate in the leadership. And also being called a lesbian was used as a way to disparage women who brought up any kind of feminist issues. The article really focuses on the experiences of Chicanas during this time period in the college setting as they tried to participate in the student movements that were going on during that time period. Now, one of the unique aspects of this particular generation of Chicanas is that they were the first generation of Chicanas that were attending college. And so they had to deal a lot of with a lot of challenges, right, and obstacles of being kind of the first in the family, not just the first to go to college from their families, but the first ones to be on a college campus in significant numbers. And so the reading talks about how that experience impacted these young women at an individual personal level, but also then had an impact on their activism. So the reading talks about the experiences of these women, how they became involved in student activism as a way against a lot of the isolation they felt, and as a way to survive, as a way to create a sense of community for themselves. They talked about how many of these women felt guilty about leaving their family responsibilities, particularly for those that were living on campus. Others talked about the idea of survivor guilt, where they would compare how good their lives were now on campus compared to that of their families back home. Invisibility exacerbated within the classroom was another issue where they were often ignored or mistreated by faculty and their peers. Women also talked about the lack of control over reproduction because abortions were not legal during this time, and how often pregnancy or lack of access to any form of birth control would become an issue for retaining these young women in college. The article also talked about how these women would turn to Chicano student organizations on campus, but were often experiencing challenges there as well, where competition was created among women for sexual attention from the quote-unquote heavies or the male leadership of these organizations. Others were perceived as sellouts or lesbians for bringing in any kind of feminist politics. The reading also talked about how political feminism and the ideal Chicana image was also upheld by these student organizations, where they upheld a certain definition of the family and how it produced a political feminism through which male leadership defined the movement as patriarchal and defined women as a strong, long-suffering woman who kept the Chicano family intact. And so the expectation was that these women would uphold, right, that kind of role in their participation in these student organizations as well. In response, many of these women chose to create their own Chicana organizations on these campuses and try to create a way of bringing women together and to create a sense of solidarity among them. And one was through this concept of hermanidad, which was a Chicana definition of sisterhood that responded to Chicano brotherhood and named gendered racism and the way patriarchal power divided women. And it also tried to address Chicana competition over the attention of male leaders to sort of educate young women about how they were being in a way set up, right, to compete with each other over each other's boyfriends or what have you, and how that gets in the way of creating solidarity among women. Other points to highlight from this reading that were interesting were in the interview with Ana Nieto Gomez, she talks about how she gains the respect from men by using quote unquote unladylike language, using cursing as a way to gain equality with male leadership. Using this language made the women heard, whereas before engaging in this kind of masculinist language, their ideas were ignored unless they were articulated by men. So they had to kind of perform in a masculine kind of way, talk in a masculine kind of way for the men to even pay attention to them as leaders. The reading also talked about how Chicano men were also navigating their own masculinity during this time period as college students. So they were experiencing shifting definitions of Chicano masculinity, which were typically based at this time period on manual labor and how many calluses you had on your hands, where if you're a college student, you didn't have calluses on your hand. You weren't necessarily participating in manual labor. So they were trying to articulate a different way to demonstrate their manhood. So upholding patriarchal roles between women and men within these organizations became an alternative way of confirming their masculinity. And it became this kind of performance of their masculinity became defined or discussed as chingon politics, which advocates for culture uncritically and defines concepts and styles of leadership in a patriarchal way. The final concept that comes up in the article, particularly towards the end, is this idea of double militancia, where even though women, Chicana women were creating their own organizations as a response to how they were being treated by the male leadership in organizations like Mecha, for example, that didn't mean that they stopped participating in Mecha. It just meant that now they had extra meetings and extra work to do. So they went to the Chicana women's organizations and participated and were active there. And then they still participated in the Chicano student organizations like Mecha and participated and supported, right, their efforts as well. So it's kind of another way of the double day that we talked about before that women had, who would not only work outside the home, but then would come home at the end of the day from work and then have the domestic work to do within their households. These women were also kind of doing a double amount of work because they were being militant both within Chicano nationalist organizations and also within Chicana feminist organizations. So they were doing sort of double the work of the movement in a bigger picture. So that ends our lecture for this week. I look forward to your thoughts in the discussion post. Have a wonderful week.